With one leaking disclosure, Princess Anne, the most stoic figure in the palace, broke decades of silence. Nor about Harry or Meghan, nor about the king, but about young Prince Louis, and a secret that his own mother struggled mightily to keep hidden. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve further into what this actually implies for the royal family. Months had passed with whispers behind heavy curtains, talks held behind closed doors, and the media kept at bay. But the shroud was torn away by a single document. A top royal correspondent's email unexpectedly contained a classified report that was never supposed to be seen. The unidentified source. The content is explosive. The headline struck like a bolt of lightning. What Catherine was afraid would be revealed is confirmed by Anne. There was more to the leak than just a slip. Every finger pointed in the same direction, and it was a calculated motion. Anne the princess. The idea that Anne had gone too far set off alarms throughout Buckingham Palace, especially for someone who had established her reputation on iron discipline and steadfast commitment. There was more than simply worry in the leaked document. There was a pattern. It followed Prince Louis through months of behavioral clues, psychological warning flags, and emotional anomalies. Anxieties during royal travels and observations made during intimate family gatherings. A senior assistant even issued a veiled warning, writing, "The boy is not himself." The report was thorough, too extensive to be a coincidence. Someone had been observing, and there had been concern. Like wildfire, speculation spread. Was Anne acting by herself? Or was she the official spokesperson for a group inside the palace that was determined to bring the truth to light? She had, after all, long been regarded as the moral compass of the monarchy, obstinate but never careless. Was this a subdued uprising or a frantic plea for assistance? The reporters barged through the palace gates for days, demanding answers. Naturally, Anne remained silent. Don't deny. No affirmation. Just that distinctively severe demeanor that spoke everything without revealing anything. She was utterly silent. And it did nothing but fuel the fires. The mood within Kensington Palace descended into fear. The disclosure was reported to have taken Catherine entirely by surprise. She was clearly shaken, according to aides, and was frantically trying to figure out what had been communicated and why. It was cruelly timed. She had just started to regain her reputation in public when her private life was once again scrutinized. According to insiders, William insisted on meeting with senior aides immediately. The level of tension increased. Some were concerned that the monarchy's meticulously maintained facade was starting to crumble under the weight of its own secrets. However, one question remained beneath the rage, the same question that no one dared to voice aloud. What was contained in that leak? What was so destructive that future Queen Catherine will do anything to stifle it? Catherine had fought a secret war behind Kensington's gilded walls, not against scandal, but against heartache. Nobody was permitted to discuss how her son was evolving, up until now. The change hadn't happened overnight. Only a mother could detect the slow, subtle changes in Louis's character. Quiet sighs replaced the laughter that had once filled the palace halls. His limitless energy dispersed. He spoke more slowly. His once inquisitive eyes now frequently appeared far away, nearly unapproachable. Long before anyone else did, Catherine sensed that something was off. However, even she was unable to foresee the extent to which everything would fall apart. Initially, it was written off as stress, which made sense considering the upheaval that had shaken the family. Catherine's own medical recuperation, King Charles's health, and the constant public pressure. However, this was not like the others. Louis was retreating, not merely reacting, and it wasn't a short-term retreat. It was profound, inside, and getting darker every day. Quietly, Catherine started writing in her journal, recording in secret the moments and patterns that troubled her. He's vanishing. She broke in ways I can't repair when she wrote. She was the only one intended to hear the words. Later on, however, they would be included in the leaked documents that rocked the palace. She didn't want to tell anyone, not even her closest aides, about the storm she was carrying inside her at the moment. Princess Anne was only known to one person, and even then, Catherine had a purpose for selecting her and remained silent. She took action. Therapists were consulted in private, via dependable family physicians rather than through formal procedures. Sessions were planned during William's travels and away from the media. The royal calendar has nothing in it. No trace might exist. Catherine was afraid that the tab would misrepresent the facts and turn her son's agony into a new story. Louis was portrayed by the palace as the lively, gregarious young king who brought joy to a family that was frequently overwhelmed by responsibility. Now, however, that image was in danger. Catherine struggled to decide whether to uphold the illusion of the throne or the truth. Ultimately, she decided to remain silent. She believed she could control it, keep it under control, heal him in private, and stay out of the conflagration. However, she misjudged the strength of what Louis was carrying. Her quiet was overpowered by the symptoms. He would wake up in the middle of the night crying and unable to talk. At family meals, he abruptly stops talking and looks blankly at his plate. Even seasoned staff members were disturbed by outbreaks of wrath that seemed to be caused by nothing. Every day, Catherine's heart ached again, but she remained silent. She was still healing herself, and now she was using all her energy to protect Louis from an incomprehensible reality. However, even the most resilient barriers can be breached by trauma. Even while the royal image was meticulously maintained, it was disintegrating within the palace. Catherine was aware that someone would eventually discover what she was making such a valiant effort to conceal. However, if it weren't for Princess Anne's one instance of royal disobedience, the secret could still be unknown. Although Princess Anne has always followed her own standards, she would have been implicated in this situation if she had remained silent. Anne chose the truth and defied all the rules as Louis spiraled out of control and the palace engaged in political maneuvering. It took place at Balmoral, a little frail family that was intended to convey stability and unity, everything the Queen was fighting to uphold. However, the fracture lines that no one else dared to admit were visible behind the meticulously staged pictures and practiced laughs. She observed Louis, the energetic child, move around rooms as if he were a ghost. His mouth was the only part of his smile. His eyes were still hollow, even after he laughed. Then he froze in the middle of an apparently harmless chat, blank in the middle of a phrase. He was unable to meet her gaze. Anne saw the warning signs right away. They weren't strange. The stifling weight of being born into duty, the stiff performance, and the hushed expectations were all things she had personally experienced. She had learnt to hide and to suppress as a child. In the eyes of a boy who was far too young to handle it, she was now witnessing the cycle repeat. She was troubled and transformed when she returned to London. With stark clarity, she raised the alarm and asked to meet with key aides. Louis wasn't feeling well. It was absolutely necessary to intervene, not months later or behind closed royal walls. The answer? A wall of institutional quiet and well-groomed grins. Monitor, manage, and protect the image. It was a passing phase in their views. A storm was building in Anne's. Even Catherine, feeling overburdened and worn out, implored Anne to wait, to allow Louis further time to prevent another media frenzy that could jeopardize his already precarious condition. However, Anne was aware of what was taking place. Louis was not being healed by time. He was being buried deeper by it. Days later, she had a private moment in the corridor that finally broke her. Louis had strayed from a relative group. Anne discovered him sitting by himself next to the stairway. His voice broke the silence when she asked whether he was all right. "I no longer know how to be royal." Anne's self-control was broken by 7 words. She went directly to William. The altercation was unfiltered and insisted that they behave now as parents rather than royals. William hesitated, caught between maintaining the palace apparatus and defending his son. He wasn't prepared to announce the crisis to the world. Anne had had enough of containment, but he still thought it could be contained. She had seen too many people broken by this institution. Louis, she refused to let it break. So she did, silently, firmly. She provided a trusted journalist an internal wellness report that was never intended for the media. Just facts, no statement, no attribution. Clinically painful facts. She also started a fire that the palace was unable to put out. It became evident as the palace struggled to manage the aftermath. This was more than the hardships of a boy. It was about a family that was about to fall apart. The facade beyond the palace walls was crumbling. The public witnessed picture ops. Louis observed a lack of feeling, fear, and quiet. And suddenly, the price was getting too high. The Waleses smiled in public. Conversations persisted. There were speeches. However, the atmosphere within their house was oppressive. For as long as it could, Catherine's power had kept them together. But it was insufficient. The weight of quiet finally broke her resolve in a private meeting with her aides. "I thought I was protecting him," she said in a tearful voice. And it became evident in that one instant that her guilt was no longer private. She was being drowned by it. William wasn't much better. He was buried under a pile of obligations, unable to see the signs that had always been in front of him, because he was torn between father feeling and national duty. Louis had ceased asking questions, skipping meals, and having nightmares. He placed the guilt on himself, and his comments betrayed that self-punishment. Being powerful was all I could think about. I didn't notice when he began to unravel. However, Catherine and William weren't the only ones in pain. Once the silent rock between her brothers, Charlotte also started to retreat. It had disastrous repercussions. She stopped dancing in the hallways and answering questions about public appearances. Employees observed her hovering more frequently, uncertain and concerned, close to Louis's door. A child torn between responsibility and bewilderment. Then, the unavoidable moment arrived. In the playroom by himself, one of the royal nannies heard Louis sobbing into his stuffed animal. "Why do they all act like I'm okay?" The illusion that everything could still be hidden was destroyed by the words, which did more than just cause pain. Employees looked at each other silently. The facts were out. To each other, not to the media. There was a crisis in the family. Catherine took action. She abruptly and unexplainably took Louis from his public school. No press releases were made. No parent conferences. Nothing but quiet. Staff hallways were rocked by the withdrawal. All of a sudden, plans were changed. Events were canceled. And protective gear was tightened. According to one assistant, the Wales household entered a state of complete emotional lockdown. Among the deuce to bide, is it? Even the sunlight felt heavy inside the cottage. They stopped sharing meals. Discussions became short exchanges. Louis didn't say much, and when he did, it was brief and far away, exhausted. Now the lively youngster whom the world had loved was a ghost in his own house. Catherine did everything she could, including reading to him and spending the night next to him. Even brought in items and toys from his early years that he was familiar with. However, nothing ignited the light once more. Overwhelmed, William started skipping his own meetings to spend time in silence outside his son's door. Waiting? I'm hoping. The appearance of control had crumbled. For this, there was no protocol, no set of rules, no royal blueprint for destroying emotions. The only terrible reality was that they were losing their son. Not to cause controversy, not to rebel, but to something far scarier, quiet. However, despite the internal turmoil, the monarchy's terror was greater. When the whole truth about Louis was revealed, how would the public respond? Palace officials wrote memos as a kid suffered. Their strategy? To take Louis off the radar before anyone realized something was amiss? However, the leak ensured that everyone was aware. The public was never supposed to read the internal memo. It had a confidential label, circulated only among communication strategists and high palace employees. Its contents, however, were terrifying. A directive was described in therapeutic terms under an approach called visibility realignment. Louis was to have his appearances reduced and his image gradually faded out. Any photo opportunity or engagement with him would be rerouted to highlight Charlotte, who, according to the memo, was calm, consistent, and trouble-free. Just icy calculus, meant to safeguard an institution rather than a youngster, with no reference to Louis' suffering or recognition of his emotional breakdown. In one area, the team talked about controlling media narratives by removing previous digital footage that included Louis' bright smile, his humorous outbursts, and his balcony moments, as if removing him from search results could erase the truth. Once enamored with the young prince, journalists were subtly misdirected, provided softer distractions and fresh stories. The palace was concealing the situation rather than dealing with it. One of the first people to see the strategy that had been disclosed was Princess Anne, who was incensed. She didn't hold back when she confronted the head of communications at the palace behind closed doors. Emotional censoring is what this is. She lost her temper. To save headlines, you don't keep a child's trauma contained. Her normally calm voice wavered with anger. For Anne, this was brutality, disguised as diplomacy, not just incompetence. But Catherine's response was a completely different matter. According to aides, she grew pale, and then became silent when the document touched her hands, then merely requested to be left alone. A few hours later, she came out with one sentence and red-rimmed eyes. Keeping him off camera is more important to them than keeping him alive. Whatever royal conditioning had kept her together was shattered by the anguish of that discovery. She could no longer put up with the crossing of a line. It was reported that William abruptly canceled his upcoming public appearance after reading the memo. He walked the halls in rage for hours. He allegedly threatened to step down from a significant royal endeavor, according to one advisor. What are we doing here if this is how we treat our kids? He wasn't acting out his rage. It was primordial. Right then, he wasn't a royal. He was a father who had recently learned that his son had been labeled a public relations liability. Inside the palace, the fallout was quick. The communications team had to retract a number of recommendations. There were no plans to highlight Charlotte. Coordinators of the media were instructed to take a seat. However, the harm was already done. The leak revealed what many had long suspected, that a culture of denial, a machine designed to survive rather than care, lied behind the polished facade of duty and tradition. A new treachery from across the Atlantic would spark a royal war while Kensington reeled from betrayal. Prince Harry unleashed a truth bomb from across the globe. He didn't use subtlety. The cycle is this: keep it hidden, refuse to believe it, offer the child as a sacrifice to the crown. The royal dispute then descended into nuclear war. It couldn't have come at a more turbulent time. Harry intervened with a scathing interview that reopened existing wounds and brought new ones into the public eye just as the palace attempted to recover control of the story. He did not merely condemn the institution, but his voice was unmistakably fiery. He denounced it. He said Louis was being subjected to the same emotional erasing that had ruined his youth. He said that the crown had not learned. Nothing had changed. It continued to consume itself. He made harsh allegations, and they sounded too familiar to many. He talked about being hushed at times. When his world was crumbling, he was urged to smile, of grieving while being paraded in front of cameras. And now, watching as Louis is silently removed from view, his voice deleted, his image cleansed. Harry witnessed the same script being repeated. I've experienced it. He said, I've carried the scars. They're putting that burden on Louis now. However, the storm didn't stop there. In a succinct but incisive comment that sent shockwaves across the media, Meghan entered the discussion. To maintain protocol, you don't hide a child's suffering. She reframed the entire scenario in 13 words. It had nothing to do with the regal image. It concerned the inability to shield a child from the same mechanism that had devoured into Windsor blood for generations. The public's response was immediate. The headlines were divided. News channels offered special coverage with conflicting pundits, one side defending the Waleses, the other echoing Harry's concerns. Hashtags trended. Opinion pieces become brutal. The matter was no longer private. It was now a worldwide spectacle. People were now picking sides. Inside Kensington Palace, the reaction was volcanic. William was glowing. He slammed the door to his office and said, "He has no idea what we're dealing with." According to aides, nothing. To him, Harry's statements weren't just wrong. They were a betrayal. William had been dealing with a damaged son, a sick father, and a collapsing kingdom for the past year. The brother who had left had now come back to throw stones from the other side of the ocean, not to offer assistance. Catherine, who was already weak, was heartbroken. She had battled to keep Louis out of the news, to protect what little privacy he still possessed. And now, her son's pain, the most vulnerable portion of her existence, had been turned into royal weapons. This struggle, which had been intensely personal, was now being fought in public, analyzed by outsiders who had no concept what it was like to have your child fall apart inside the walls of a castle. Anne, for her part, declined to comment. No public statements, no explanations. However, her loud, purposeful silence just fueled further conjecture. Was she protecting herself from the circus of the media? Or did she unspokenly concur with Harry's brutal reality? And the unimaginable occurred just when it appeared that the royal family would break under the pressure of its own silence. Catherine moved to the front, put an end to concealing. No more fake smiles. In a handwritten letter, Catherine, the future queen, begged for understanding, not as a princess, but as a mother. The entire globe paused to pay attention. The official palace channels were not used to issue the letter. It wasn't typed, evaluated, or emotionally cleansed. It was unprocessed. It was all that the monarchy had been attempting to hide for months, and it was personal. The note started with a silent confession, written in Catherine's distinctive hand. Support for Louis's emotional healing is currently being provided. She raised the curtain after saying those words. The lad behind the cheeky smiles and balcony waving, the child everyone loved, was suddenly engaged in a much more serious conflict than anyone could have predicted. Catherine, however, didn't stop there. She spoke candidly about the pain of seeing a youngster vanish behind his own silence. A youngster who used to make everyone laugh had become silent, reclusive, and transformed. As his mother, she had witnessed it occur and was helpless to stop it. Her remarks were not meant to elicit pity. They begged for understanding, empathy, and space. Above all, they exposed the one thing she had been most afraid of, that keeping his battle a secret would have made it worse. She acknowledged that she kept quiet. She cared too much, not because she wasn't concerned. Catherine was afraid of being judged, the headlines and the conjecture that would ensue if the public perceived a flaw in the ideal royal family's image. She feared being held accountable and perceived as a failure mother. So even as Louis started to fall apart, she said nothing. But she knew there was no more time for silence as the institution collapsed and Harry's charges blazed over the world. Reputation management was no longer an issue. She was trying to save her son. It was an instantaneous and overwhelming response. A tidal wave of empathy swept through social media. Let Louis Heal became popular on all platforms in a matter of hours. Thousands of people, including moms, educators, mental health professionals, and even complete strangers, shared their personal accounts of silently seeing children's struggles. A global nerve had been touched by her vulnerability, which is so uncommon for someone in her position. Advocates for mental health referred to it as a turning point for the crown. An organization founded on stoicism had at last demonstrated something genuine and human. A future queen had, for the first time, opted for honesty over perfection. And she wasn't simply greeted with applause. They came together to support her. The letters came flooding in. Not from public figures or celebrities, but from mothers who understood the anxiety of witnessing their child's transformation. From educators who've seen the warning indicators on a daily basis. From survivors who were that quiet kid once. It wasn't just a door that Catherine opened. She initiated a discussion that the monarchy had shunned for many years. It was a brave moment, one that was born out of love as much as desperation. A mother's love that went against social norms, titles, and expectations. She'd remained silent long enough. The world was now paying attention. The real reason behind Anne's choice to reveal the secret, however, was still a mystery, even as the public accepted the family's candor. A handwritten entry from weeks before to the disclosure is found by aides deep under Anne's personal documents. It exposes nothing political. It hurts to be human. Louis wasn't the only factor in the decision to leak. Anne's ghosts were at issue. It was not her intention to be discovered. Under layers of handwritten letters and speeches, the leather-bound, well-worn diary was stored in a drawer and seldom ever opened. However, it came to light during a normal archival examination, and what it contained completely altered the course of events. It was not only reflections on the pages. They made a confession, one that clarified Anne's actions as well as her motivations. Anne wrote in flowing cursive about memories that had been buried for decades under public obligation and protocol. Chilly mornings, dinners that are quiet. Expectations were so inflexible that they prevented feeling from developing. She claimed to have been taught poise, but not consolation. Accountability, but never let go. And most agonizingly, of the times when she was a child in need of warmth and could only find it in distance. She wrote that we were taught to bow before we could cry and to smile before we could speak. It was reflection, not resentment. A confrontation with a childhood that had trained her to act rather than to feel. She also noticed the same shadows in Louis, a boy instructed to remain motionless, grin broadly, and suppress his emotions. The identical weight that had previously broken her was causing a boy to shatter. There was only one line, twice underlined. I will not tolerate another Windsor's decline. The hush that grew between William and Catherine as they read those lines was intense and painful. It wasn't an assault, it wasn't rebellion, it was defense. Not against scandal, but against the recurrence of past events. And a door opened just then. Picking up the phone, Catherine contacted Anne to extend an invitation rather than to confront her. Anne arrived at Adelaide Cottage the following day. It was a brief visit. Keep quiet. No personnel, no statements, no press. Louis and Anne alone. Unaware of the weight she carried, he had been sketching when she came in. Then he raised his head. He stared for a moment, unsure. Then, though, came a single, gentle, yet certain sentence. Did you not abandon me? He didn't say anything else. And it was sufficient. It was the moment when confidence was restored among a family that had almost fallen apart out of silence, not only between a youngster and an aunt. It wasn't a dramatic moment. It moved slowly, deliberate. This time, the family rebuilt around healing rather than duty. Discussions became more sincere. Schedules became more accommodating. Therapy was no longer a secret. It was welcomed. Though he didn't immediately revert to his previous self, Louis started to exhibit glimmerings of interest, outbursts of laughing, and persistent, steady eye contact. As a survivor, as well as a royal, someone who had braved the cold and wouldn't allow anyone else to do the same. She had always been protected by her quiet. It was now her voice, though. Then, the moment that made all the difference arrived. A secretly released snapshot that was never intended for public consumption. Just one picture. No press, no crown. Beside Anne, it was just Louis grinning, barefoot, and carrying a watering can. In a matter of minutes, that picture went viral. It did more than soften the story, though. It was rewritten. There was no media strategy behind the image. No royal photographer was present. Kensington Palace has not given its consent. A family friend who was at Anne's estate took it. A silent moment caught in transit. It wasn't intended to make headlines. However, once it appeared, and was anonymously shared on a local parenting site, it went viral online, with a force that no press release could match. Louis wasn't posing in the photo. He was not acting like a king. He was only a young boy. With muck on his hands, he laughed. The air caused cheeks to flush. Anne stood at his side, calm, steady, keeping an eye on him as if they knew where he had been and where he still needed to go. No palace walls could be seen, just growth and the dirt. The people didn't perceive any controversy in that frame. They saw recovery. The moment was ideal. The disclosures Catherine had made were still being processed by the country. The confusion that surrounded Harry's charges had not yet subsided. However, the picture broke through everything. A quiet moment amid a cacophony of sounds. The story changed for the first time in months. The people chose to see something else, not because the palace ordered it, something tangible. The image became a movement almost immediately. There were campaigns on social media, "Let the royals be kids." The message united parents, educators, and therapists. The picture was reposted by celebrities. Charities that support mental health reported unprecedented increases in outreach, contributions, and new volunteers. Louis was no longer merely a royal infant who suffered in quiet. Instead, he became a symbol of fortitude and a reminder that everyone needs care, regardless of their rank. Normally immune to vulnerability, the monarchy had been compelled to display it. However, the public responded to that vulnerability with compassion rather than sympathy, recognizing assistance. There was a slight lowering of the walls between crown and commoner. It no longer seemed important to create the illusion of perfection. Assistants inside the castle started subtly changing their tone. Press releases became softer. The engagements were reassessed. The topic of conversation changed from looks to well-being. It was the start of something, but not a revolution. Louis was blissfully oblivious to the impact he had caused throughout it all. Under Anne's supervision, he carried on with his days, asking questions, watering plants, and exploring freely. They were lifting the weight that had previously crushed him, one tiny, sincere moment at a time. What started out as a leak has now changed a legacy. The boy who was almost erased, Louis, rose to become the prince who served as a reminder to the world of what it meant to feel, and maybe what healing really means. I appreciate you watching. Remember to subscribe and like. We'll see you in the upcoming one.